I'm in the fumbling twilight of my years, less than 2 months from my 100th birthday. I joined the army when I was 17 years, 9 months, and 2 weeks of age. But when the war broke out, I was only 14 years of age. I never thought I would take part in it. In fact, when I joined the army, one of my aims was to save £1 a month from my pay. 1 week's pay being £1, 1 shilling, and that's the equivalent of £1 5p. In those days, I could send 160 letters for £1. I was sent to India for my commission service and commission training, and I went to the Indian Military Academy in Dehradun. And from then, I was posted to the 1st Gurkhas, and from Dharamsala, where our depot was, I was posted to the 1st Gurkha Rifles in central Burma at the end of June or beginning of July. First Gurkhas were in 100 Brigade with the 4th, 10th Gurkha Rifles and the 3rd, 14th Punjab Regiment in 20 Division. And the other brigades were 32 Brigade and 80 Brigade. As a very young man, I was not sent to the war until I started asking to be sent to see what it was like. And I can only recall one long, large patrol of the bits and pieces of work that I did. It was the B Company under a Major Murat. I still don't know quite why he behaved as he did, but we left. I can't remember the name of the village, but we left and went into the jungle, and after walking several hours, we made a camp, and then a patrol moved ahead of the main body, and I was with company headquarters, and moving forward, we found a Japanese lying down on the track. I now cannot remember whether he was starving or wounded, but I had with me a Japanese English book. On the left of the page were English sentences and Japanese sentences. On the right of the page were English answers and Japanese answers to the possible questions on the left hand of the page. I was asked, because the company commander did not have one of these books, to find out from this man lying on the ground, I've no idea of his rank, how many troops there were in front of us. Would the patrol be outnumbered? Would it be ambushed, for instance? So I got down next to this Japanese, and I showed him the book, and I showed him the question, which I thought meant, how many men are there to your front? And he looked down the right-hand side of the page and gave a 6-figure answer. And I turned round to the major and told him a 6-figure answer. And there was incredulity only in his eyes. And it transpired that the man gave me his army number, not the number of the troops in front. In any case, if I'd had my senses about me, I'd have realized that a 6-figure number of troops in front would be unknown to a man lying on the ground. As I was near to him, I did not notice his hand going round the back of his body, and he was trying to get either a dagger or a pistol out to kill me. And luckily, an observant soldier next to me put his hand out and stopped the Japanese from getting his weapon out. That in itself doesn't sound much, but the Japanese were retreating to the Pegu-Yomas. And of course, what you must remember is that it was the first time in Japanese history that they had been defeated to that particular level, even when they were fighting the Russians and the Chinese before, many years previously. Although they had had some victories, they had had some defeats. It was after that that I was sent on a course, a photo reconnaissance, interpretation, a reading of aerial photos course in Rangoon. And that was the time that the atom bombs were dropped. The first one was dropped. And it may seem strange these days, so many years afterwards, but it meant nothing to us. All we had heard was there was an extra large bang. And while I was down there, I remember the Rangoon Cathedral had been, the Rangoon Cathedral had been desecrated by the Japanese, and it had to be I don't know the word in English, but it had to be remade re-holy. And the only way they managed to do it was of an evening. They got the senior padre there, and there was no electricity, and no one could see anything. And I can remember them driving a jeep up the cathedral steps into the cathedral, turned right, and it's put the headlights on, and those of us in the cathedral body could get hymn books and read what we had to read from the Land Rover. There were jeeps, headlights. I returned to the battalion, and I remember we were having our supper. The village was Othigon, which apparently means a village just across the river up a slight hill. And the house we were in was a Burmese house on stilts. And the field telephone clanked. It didn't ring, it clanked. And the adjutant, Gordon Keane, put his knife and fork down and went to the telephone, which is a bit away. And we heard him say, "Oh, no, oh, wonderful, ah, oh," like that for some time. And we all wondered what it was about. And he came back and said, "The war's over, hooray." And I remember the mess havildar, Sasi Thapa, put on a gramophone record, Lily Marlene. And the news went to those two rifle companies. The other two were on detachment. And the two rifle companies, all got out of their bunks and got their rifles and started firing into the air. Gordon Keane started drinking gin, and Sussy didn't want him drunk. So what he did was he had an empty bottle that he poured water into, and as Gordon drank his gin, Sussy merely poured water into his glass. But even so, because of the gin, he could sniff the gin, he still got drunk. I didn't drink. Next morning, we had a late breakfast, and the telephone clanked again. And the adjutant Gordon Keane went and answered, "Oh no, oh no, oh no." We all wondered what it was about. He came back and said, "Last night's telephone call was a mistake. The war's not over." And we've been told to send a patrol to look out for a large Japanese party somewhere in the Pegu-Yumas. The war did not finish, in fact, for another week, and we were all delighted that there were no casualties. VJ Day. I remember when the war was finished, and we celebrated by all getting together and singing a song. I sang "Home, James, and Don't Spare the Horses," and the CEO sang a Nepali song, and there was a Tamil signaller who sang Ave Maria. I think it was a couple of days before that I had to go down to 20th headquarters in Prome to fetch a rarity, a lot of beer. And I took a jeep and a driver, of course, and an escort. And we went down to Prome, and on the way back, we passed a mobile canteen run by the WASB, Women's Auxiliary Service Burma. And these two ladies had a mobile canteen. As we got to it, with plenty of time to spare, the driver said, "Sir, let's have a cup of tea." I said, "All right, you and your mate go and have a cup of tea." They came back a little later and said, "It's no good, this canteen. It hasn't got what I want." So I said, "What do you want?" He said, "I want a horizontal bomb." And I queried it. I said, "You mean an atom bomb?" He said, "No, no, no, not that." I think he knew what I meant. "No, it's a small, cool stuff." And I thought it was something that we had given us a little tube of cool stuff for mosquitoes, against mosquitoes. And I said, "Are you sure there's no horizontal bomb?" And he said, "Well, I think there ought to be." You go and find out. So I went to the driver first, a British soldier. I said, "You got any new stuff in the stock?" He said, "No, sir." I said, "What have you got?" He gave me a few names. I said, "Have you got any horizontal bombs?" And he said, "No, I don't think so. I haven't heard about them." So I went to the back where there was a crowd of Indian soldiers and the two ladies. And I said, happened to be the junior one, "Excuse me, have you got a horizontal bomb?" And she looked at me and shook her head. I said, "I beg your pardon." So I repeated myself, rather wishing that I'd never been asked in the first place. And she said, "I asked the senior lady." And the senior lady came to me and said, "I really haven't got enough time for this. Uh, what is it you want?" And I said, "A horizontal bomb, as my driver wants it." And she said, "We don't stock that stuff." And I said, "Please, may I ask your permission to let him into the back of your vehicle to see if he can find one?" And she shook her head. It's never allowed. I said, "Just this once." "Yes, all right, make it quick." So I got the driver and put him in the wagon, and he searched around, and rather like a terrier sniffing a rat, he put his hand to a box and he produced something. He said, "Sir, fire, fire." And he brought it out, and I looked at it. It wasn't a horizontal bomb, it's an oriental bomb, the stuff you put on your head if you've got a headache. We didn't talk to each other for the rest of the journey back to battalion headquarters. After VJ Day, we were told we were going to Saigon. Nobody had heard of Saigon. We didn't know where it was. So the CEO, Colonel Jarvis, said to me, "Go to the Burmese schoolmaster," and asked for his atlas. And so I went to the Burmese schoolmaster and I went and asked him for his atlas. And I found out that Saigon was the capital of a place called Cochin, China, in French Indochina. And that merely had memories of schoolboy stamp collections. Otherwise, it meant nothing to us. So I went back and told him that we were going to a French colony. And we had orders to go there, and we packed up our kit. And the code word was Masteron. And we painted everything with Masteron on it. And then we got an order, it was a misspelling for masterdom, I remember, and we had to repaint every box. And I thought, how extraordinary. Did it matter if the spelling was different from the original one? Because there's no one else with that particular name. But we had to change everything. So we went down by train from Ottigon through Perm down to Rangoon, and we stopped halfway. And naughtily, I got out and went into the engine, and I drove the train, not the whole way, the rest of the way, but far enough. Now, I'm going to go on to what we had to do in Saigon. Our aim, in fact, was to disarm the Japanese army that was there. And there were two battalions, a major's command, Takahashi Butai, and a captain's command, the Yamagishi Butai. And all the locals, the Viet Minh, people in Vietnam, as we call it now, but they call themselves the Viet Minh, thought that the British had come to give them their independence. Although the last thing the Japanese did was to give them their independence from France. And the people there thought that we had come to collect the Japanese weapons and arms and let them be their own independent country. But they were sad when they found that the French were staying on. There was the second division, Deuxième Division, from Lake Chad under General Leclerc. And as soon as the locals saw that the French were staying, they gave us a lot of leaflets. I still have one. A warning to our friends, the British. There will soon be an armed struggle between us and the French. Be prudent and do not ramble about with the French. So we didn't ramble about with the French at all. Now, the trouble was that because of fighting of the Viet Cong, or the Viet Minh, I should call them, north of Saigon, that the Japanese were not able to guard the posts in Saigon, as well as try to keep the Viet Minh away from their own other units. the stores. There were stores for a railway battalion and aerial bombs and a whole lot of other stuff. And so it was decided that the French would take over. But the French, would being proud and arrogant, would not take over from the Japs. And probably the Japs wouldn't have handed over to the French anyway. So a compromise was reached. And the first Gurkha Rifles took over from the Japs in the morning. And I remember the Naik in charge of one particular place, I think it was General Leclerc's residence, taking over from the Jap. The Japanese guard commander was a second lieutenant armed with a sword, and the war had only been over for a couple of months or so. And the Naik was slightly scared when he looked a bit wary when the sword was drawn to salute, while the Naik merely saluted normally. But the sword was put back and no further trouble. No trouble at all. And in the evening, we, the Indian Army, handed over to the French. Now, this was quite an affair in General Leclerc's residence in the garden, and two flagpoles had been put in the ground, one with the Union Jack, the British flag, and one with the French flag. And my first Gurkha Rifles had given a night and 3 men to hold the British flag down and then to unfurl the French flag. And there were buglers there, and last post, and the flag, our flag was brought down, and then rebellion, the French saluted. But when the Naik went to open up the knot at the bottom of the flagpole, it wouldn't open. And rebellion bugles finished, and the Naik was still trying to open the knot, get the knot undone. And it simply didn't work. And people were standing there, the salute, and those who had swords had them up. And eventually the Naik bent down and opened the knot with his teeth. Fine, so the rope was swinging, and then he tried to open the rope knot, under the knot by the flag. And the more he pulled, the worse it got, and nothing would open. So the Naik looked up at where the flag was still furled, knotted, and the only way he could solve the problem of getting the flag unfurled was to sit down, take his boots off, which he did. He sat down, took his boots off, and climbed the pole. And then he managed, hanging on with one hand, he got his kukri. And I remember the French faces wondering whether he was going to cut the flag and disgrace the honor of France or whatever. But he managed to get the knot open with the kukri, and the flag was unfurled when he climbed down and put his boots on. When the flag was unfurled, people stopped saluting and put their swords back into their scabbards. But the French thought, les Gurkha Marieuses, très galant, and they were very happy with the way that our men had managed to solve that particular problem. Now, we had to leave Saigon and go north. The first went to a place that looked like, spelled Tu Dau Mot. In Vietnamese, if a D has a bar across it, it's Dau. If it has no D across, it's Yao. So we went to Tu Dau Mot, and the 4th, 10th went to Tu Duc, and the 3rd, 14th went to Bien Ha. And my job was quartermaster, and the stores were brought in from various battalions. And I remember visiting a whole lot of Japanese units and telling them, yes, bring that in tomorrow, bring that in the next day. But the Viet Minh started being aggressive, and the Yamagishi Butai took casualties. It was rumored that we would have to send a column up farther north from where we were to try and relieve matters. But before then, it was Yamagishi's town north, Takahashi came, and the orders for our relationship with the Japanese had to fly a black flag. And the Japanese, didn't matter what rank the officer was, all had to salute every Indian soldier they saw. And we were told we couldn't shake hands. We had to keep them at a table's distance away. We had to use their ranks, not their names. and we sit down and they stand up. And we were trying to make them feel small. And I was by then also the intelligence officer. And I would sit down with the seer. I remember Major Takahashi coming in one day, who was the interpreter, and he saluted. And he said, I have a report, or rather, the interpreter said, I have a report. And Colonel Jarvis said, give us your report. We have captured a Russian. Shall we kill him or bring him? And the seer said, bring him. And then how do you know he's a Russian? And the answer was because he's wearing khaki uniform, he has a hammer and sickle badge in his cap and on his lapels, and he has a jar of coffee. Why that should have meant that he was a Russian, I never found out. And we said, bring him in. So in our French barracks where we lived, there were two large barrack blocks and a jail of 4 or 5 prison cells, and we put the Russian in it, and we washed his clothes for him, and we drank his coffee for him. And he told us he would not open his mouth at all until he met the Soviet ambassador in Saigon. And of course, there was no Soviet representation at all. But we were amazed because, as I said, it was just after the war, and we, the British, with the Chinese and the Soviets and the Americans, were one of the big four. And there was this man already teaching the Vietnamese how to fight against the forces of law and order. We went north. The seer then went on leave, and the 2IC Clark had to form a column, Clark Call. And we went up north to Ben Cut. And we arrived there in the evening. We had the 16th Cavalry with us, and we had the 1st Royal Battalion of the Jat MMG Regiment. And when we got to Ben Cat, there's one house, and we wanted to go in, but the door was locked. And we waited about a quarter of an hour. The Japanese major, with his comfort girl, came out, and the men spat their disgust. And we waited for a patrol of the Yamagishi Butai to come in, and at 8 o'clock we had our orders. And there was a triangle of territory, a flat road, start line, and 2 roads coming to a point. And the 16th Cavalry were going to be on one road, and the 1st Royal Battalion of the Jats were going to patrol the other road. And the B Company was from the 1st, and the Yamagishi Butai made up the infantry. And the orders were that if an Indian Army unit was with the Japanese Army unit, Imperial Japanese Army unit, the senior Indian Army officer, however much junior to the Japanese, was the commander. The Yamagishi had, I don't know how many years' service, quite a lot, and I had 10 months, but I was in command of the whole of the Yamagishi Butai and our B Company. We started off the next morning, and we got to our start line on time, and we advanced over paddy fields, scrub, overgrown rubber estates, not thick jungle, but bushy country, for about 3 or 4 hours before fire was opened on us. And as I was in command, I was looking around, wondering where the fire was coming from. And the interpreter crept up to me and said, Captain Yamagishi sends his regards and sends his respects and respectfully asks you to take the prone position. And I looked around and I realized that I and the interpreter were the only 2 people standing up. So I got down to a position near the ground, and Yamagishi crawled up to me, and we had a small O group. And Yamagishi asked if he could fire his mortars. And I said, yes, of course. And we fired them for about 15, 20 minutes. And Yamagishi asked me what I suggested. And I suggested a company attack. And he respectfully asked my respects to allow him to send a section in. So I didn't have much option. And I said, yes. And the section commander was a Japanese second lieutenant armed with a sword. And I had 4 gunmen with me, 4 workers with me. But even so, it was a situation that was almost unreal. Just as I said, the war had only ended about a couple of months. We were there from September 45 to February 46 in Indochina. And after some time, the patrol, the Japanese section that had gone down a hill, appeared up on the other side and waved us up. So we moved forward, and when I got to the bottom of the hill, there was a river, and I suddenly found myself with a man holding my legs, and I thought, gosh, I really had it now. An unsung hero in the middle of nowhere, and a head came between my legs, and I was lifted up, and I suddenly realized that the Japanese soldier was giving me a pickaback, so I needed to get my feet wet. And I looked round, and Japanese battalion headquarters were all riding on their soldiers, and my 4 Gurkha soldiers were on the back of Japanese soldiers. We got to the top, and there were only 2 enemy there, 2 men there. One was a man about 30, 35 years of age, armed with a rifle, with a great, big, enormous hole here, and he's hit by a Japanese mortar fragment and a hole in his neck. And there was another boy about 10 or 11 armed with a catapult. And there was a Japanese doctor there. And the interpreter came to me and said, the Japanese doctor said that we've got to kill those 2. And in those days, helicopters and rescue weren't in our vocabulary. And I said, well, if the Japanese doctor says that, let him do it. He said, oh, no, you've got to give permission to have them killed. And I didn't like it. It was something that I hadn't come across before. So, angry with myself, I said, yes, provided it doesn't hurt. Anyway, they're going to die in any case. And I looked round, and there were 2 or 3 Japanese on a small bank, waving their arms about. And I said to the interpreter, why are they dancing about? So he went to see, and he came back, and he'd looked at his English-Japanese dictionary, so they were Victorician, which is the only word he used for having a piss. And he said, they've seen a hand. I said, come again? They've seen a hand. So I went over, and there was this bank, and there was a hand in the leaves in the ditch, and a hand and an arm. And the Japanese had been pissing there, and this arm was going like this. And I said, pull it. Obviously looking, feeling something. I pull it, and the Japanese, no, no. And I exploded. And eventually the first Japanese bent down, and he was held by his waist by a second Japanese, and the second Japanese was held by his waist by a third Japanese, and the first Japanese pulled this man, and he was stark naked. He had the star of Tonkin tattooed on his left shoulder, and he had what looked like a brand new machine gun with a tray like magazine. And he looked up at the sky, and he bent the magazine, and he went berserk. And the Japanese were onto him in a flash, and they quietened him even before my men had time. They'll take their cookers out of their scabbards. I didn't carry a cooker. And I said to the Japanese, what's all this about? And the 2 wounded men were decoys. And this man was hiding in the ditch. And it was a rubber estate ditch, and the ditch is for water for the rubber trees, but full of leaves. And when the Japanese were pissing on him, he wondered how heavy the rain was. And when he was pulled out, he looked up at the sky, and there were no clouds at all. So he realized that his shooting us up as we were carrying the corpses out, the sick man out, and so obviously killing as many of us as he could, his plan did not come to fruition. And he was angry with himself. Years later, fast forward 30, how many years, when I was commanding a jungle warfare school, I would tell my Vietnamese students that to be successful, a secret weapon need not be modern. But we carried on, and eventually we got more, about 30 prisoners. And at the apex of the triangle, we met the French liaison officer, Colonel Turk, who'd come from Madagascar, and Major Clark. That, in fact, was more action than I had experienced in Burma. A little later, I went down to the bazaar from our battalion headquarters with 2 vehicles to get some firewood and rations, fresh rations. And a man came with a grenade, a civilian, and pushed it under the leading vehicle, and it exploded. And he ran away, and the driver got out and chased him with his kukri. And as he was about to take the man's head off, the man lunged forward, and all he did was take his left buttock off. And I stayed in the area while the other vehicle went back with him up to the battalion headquarters with no vegetables and no father, but this man to be doctored, and another vehicle came down and we finished our shopping. Yamagishi. We come now to the surrender terms. But before I start on the surrender, what I want to say is it was difficult for the Yamagishi and the Takahashi battalion because they hadn't had a war. There was no fighting in Indochina, and the French colonial troops that didn't do anything. So they hadn't lost the wars they had in Burma. And yet their discipline and relations with us was impeccable. The emperor had said, behave yourself. And I say again, the discipline and respect they had for all of us, especially little me, the only Brit, in that attack against the Viet Cong, the Viet Minh, it could not have been, they could not have been better behaved. It's a great object lesson of how powerful the emperor was. And then the surrender. I was counting 30-kilogram bombs in my store, and I had no shirt on. And Yamagishi had turned up with his interpreter, and his dress was exact. His belt and his boots, highly polished, creases in his uniform. And he said, I had some men with me helping me count. He said, will I come to him by himself? And again, an uncharitable thought did occur to me. After all, the war hadn't stopped, hadn't been over for very long. But I needn't have worried. We went into a room by ourselves. He undid his sword and he gave it to me. And there was a notice, a little handwritten notice. It was about 3.5, would it be, 100 years of age. It was his favorite sword. He had had 5 battles with it against the Chinese. And I looked later on the blade, and there were 5 nicks in the blade where he had fights. And on the paper that he'd written it out, he said, I want to give this to you because you're a gentleman and a cavalier, which was very nice of him to say that. But I think what it was that I had behaved properly during our little battles and our day out, and he had respected that I had respected their difficulty. And later I was asked by BBC Two whether I thought the rehabilitation of the Japanese had started in a way from that incident. And I said, yes, I thought so. But later, when the surrender parade came, I'll show you a photograph of it. The British officers stood both sides of the British flag, and the Gurkha officers sat my table. It was an Asian to Asian surrender. And Yamagishi marched his troops in, and they formed up, the whole battalion formed up in front of our Gurkha officers and the British officers. And one by one, the officers came and laid sword on the ground by the table, saluted Balasaur Rana, the Subedar Major, and the other officers, and tears on Yamagishi's. His second best sword. It was a moving occasion, and the men, the battalion, slouched away after the officers had given their swords, ground arms, and the men had ground their arms. Warrant officers laid their swords on the ground. The sergeants supernumerous behind also laid their rifles down, and then they took their belt off with their bayonet and laid it on the ground in close order march and out. And it was ironic that a week later I had over 1,000 swords in my stores. We had to give out to the Yamagishi Batai all the swords back so they could cut the grass on the road up. We had convoys up from Saigon every other day, every third day, and anti-ambush to clean the sides of the road. The French, just a word, they were utterly cruel and arrogant. And I remember we heard shots in the market, and I asked what it was, and a woman was picked up, raped by all the French, and then publicly shot. And I was in a vehicle the French had, and the man in charge told the driver to stop at the first man they saw walking. And this the driver did, and the man, elderly man, was pushed into the back of the vehicle, and they started beating his feet with sticks and butting him in the face with a rifle. And I shouted at them to stop. I said, "Why are you doing this?" using French. "No, he might be a spy." And I remember Pushpanasi Kaur Singh said to me, "Saab, you look the same, but you behave so differently. What is it?" And I said, "Well, what do you think the difference is?" And he said, "They're careless. They don't care." And they had, in the week we left, for the last week we were there, more casualties in the whole of our division, they went to division, than we had taken in the whole 4 months we were there. I was left in Othigon camp after the battalion had moved to Saigon to hand it over. And I had an Indian signaller and a Gurkha signaller. And I was talking to a French officer. The Indian signaller came, and I spoke to him in Urdu. And I had my Gurkha, and I spoke to him in Nepali. And the Frenchman asked me what language I was talking, and I told him. He said, "Why bother? Why don't you make them speak English?" That's what we don't in the Indian Army. We speak their language. And he said, in our army, they have to speak French. I said, "If they can't speak, what happens? Should they go hungry?" He said, "What do you do in the evenings?" And I said, "Well, we play basketball or football." And your officer's team, no, sometimes mixed. And he was horrified. He said, "You tell the referee always you have to win." And we said, "No, we normally lose." And he said, "How do you keep discipline?" All I can say in conclusion is that if the British had treated their Gurkhas like the French treated their people, we would have never had a brigade of Gurkhas, and we would have probably lost at the Indian Mutiny in 1857. Thank you. The details I have been giving you, plus, are in this book. This is the 3rd edition of this particular story. And the surrender. This picture is unique. This is the Japanese battalion bowing to the Gurkha officers sitting in front of the Union Jack. This was taken from the parrot clock, and here you can see the flag and the British officers standing beside it and the Gurkha officers in front. And this particular picture was taken when the battalion was told to ground arms and they're bending forward and they're putting their rifles on the ground.